door closed, yet no one was there to touch it. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I enjoy seeing each one. Let's step inside. The summer afternoon in the quiet village of Brambleford had the gentle, unhurried quality that belonged only to English villages that believed nothing truly dreadful could happen within their hedgerows. Bees drifted lazily among the roses, the distant church bell chimed the half-hour, and the lawns of Hawthorne House shimmered in the warm sunlight. Hawthorne House stood at the edge of the village green, a respectable Georgian building with ivy clinging to its pale stone walls. That afternoon it hosted a garden gathering arranged by its owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, to a woman who prided herself on maintaining traditions that had quietly defined the social rhythm of Brambleford for decades. Small tables were arranged across the lawn, covered with linen cloths and delicate china cups. A string quartet from the nearby town played gently beneath a white pavilion, while guests moved about with polite smiles and restrained conversation. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair beside a flower bed bursting with foxgloves. She held a cup of tea with both hands, her eyes moving about the garden with mild, pleasant interest. Anyone observing her might have thought she was simply enjoying the sunshine. Yet Miss Marple rarely missed very much. Across the lawn, Mrs. Hawthorne stood greeting guests with composed enthusiasm. "My dear Colonel Ashbury," she was saying, "you must try the lemon cakes. My cook insisted on making them exactly as they were prepared in my mother's time." Colonel Ashbury, a large man with a ruddy face and an impressive moustache, accepted the cake with military gratitude. "Nothing better than proper English baking," he declared. Nearby stood Margaret Linton, a schoolteacher recently arrived in the village. She watched the gathering with the careful curiosity of someone still learning the invisible rules that governed village society. At another table, Dr. Philip Grant spoke in low tones with Mr. Leonard Carver, the village solicitor. Their conversation appeared polite enough, though the doctor's expression occasionally tightened with faint irritation. Miss Marple observed all this with quiet interest. Village gatherings, she often reflected, resembled elaborate embroidery. At first glance, everything appeared orderly and decorative, but a closer look always revealed knots in the thread. Mrs. Hawthorne approached Miss Marple with a warm smile. "My dear Miss Marple, I do hope you're comfortable." "Perfectly, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "Your roses are quite magnificent." Mrs. Hawthorne glanced proudly toward the garden beds. "My late husband adored them. I try to keep things exactly as he left them." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "One finds people often do." Before Mrs. Hawthorne could respond, a young maid hurried across the lawn toward her. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," the girl said nervously. "Mr. Edwin Hawthorne asked if you could come inside for a moment." Mrs. Hawthorne's expression flickered with faint annoyance. "My nephew always manages to choose the worst moment," she murmured. Then she turned to the maid. "Very well. I shall come at once." She excused herself from the guests and walked briskly toward the house. Miss Marple's eyes followed her. The front door of Hawthorne House opened with a quiet creak. Mrs. Hawthorne stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. From the garden, the house appeared peaceful and still. Conversation resumed easily. The quartet played on. Several minutes passed. Margaret Linton glanced toward the house. "Has Mrs. Hawthorne been gone long?" She asked no one in particular. "Only a moment or two," said Colonel Ashbury. "Probably household matters." Dr. Grant checked his watch. "Closer to 10 minutes, I believe." The maid who had delivered the message appeared again, looking uncertain. "Has Mrs. Hawthorne come back yet?" she asked quietly. "No," said Mr. Carver. "Was she expected?" The maid hesitated. She told me to wait in the hall, but she never came through." A small ripple of unease moved through the gathering. Colonel Ashbury stood up. "Well then," he said with forced cheerfulness, "I'd better see what's keeping our hostess." He walked toward the house. The guests continued their conversations, though now voices had grown softer. Miss Marple set down her teacup. A few moments later, the Colonel's voice echoed sharply from inside the house. "Good heavens! Someone come here!" The garden fell silent. Chairs scraped against the grass as guests hurried toward the open door. Inside the entrance hall, Colonel Ashbury stood pale and rigid. Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne lay on the polished wooden floor beside the staircase. Her eyes were open, fixed upon nothing, and a dark bruise had begun to form at her throat. Dr. Grant knelt beside her, his face grim. "I'm afraid she's dead," he said quietly. The maid began to sob. "How could this happen?" whispered Margaret Linton. Colonel Ashbury looked around the hall in stunned disbelief. "But we were all outside," he said. "Every one of us." Mr. Carver spoke slowly, his voice thin. "The front door never opened again." Silence filled the hallway. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression calm though her eyes had sharpened slightly. She glanced toward the front door. It stood closed, perfectly ordinary. Quiet, just as it had been moments before Mrs. Hawthorne entered the house. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "A very curious thing," she murmured almost to herself. "After all." Her eyes moved slowly across the room. The door closed. "And yet," she said softly, "someone must have come through it unseen." For several moments no one moved. The old hall, with its black and white tiles, grandfather clock and polished umbrella stand, seemed to have become a stage upon which some impossible tableau had been arranged. Outside, through the open doorway to the garden, the soft strains of the quartet had ceased in the middle of a bar, as though even the music had recoiled. Dr. Grant placed 2 fingers once more against Mrs. Hawthorne's wrist, though his expression had already made the answer plain. "There is nothing to be done," he said at last, rising from his knees. "She has been dead at least several minutes." The maid, Alice, made a frightened sound and clutched the banister as though her own legs might fail her, though Colonel Ashbury took her by the elbow and guided her to a chair in the morning room just off the hall. Mr. Carver removed his spectacles, polished them needlessly, and replaced them on his nose. "We must send for Inspector Wells at once." "Yes, of course," said Dr. Grant, "and no one must leave the house or grounds." This announcement, though entirely reasonable, produced a visible stirring among the guests. A village gathering was one thing, being held as possible witnesses to murder was quite another. Margaret Linton stood very still near the doorway, her face pale but composed. She looked not at the body, but at the staircase, as though trying to imagine what had happened there. Near her, Edwin Hawthorne had appeared from the back corridor, his hair slightly disordered, and his face carrying the dazed astonishment of a man who had only just learned that life had turned against him. He was a man in his middle 30s, well-dressed but carrying about him an air of carelessness that Mrs. Hawthorne had often described, in private, as weakness of character. "What is it? What has happened?" he demanded. Then, seeing his aunt on the floor, he stopped short. Good God! He took one step forward and then another, but Dr. Grant blocked him gently. "Don't touch anything." Edwin stared. "Touch anything? She's my aunt." "Yes," said Dr. Grant evenly, "and she has been strangled." At that, the word seemed to pass through the hall like a draught through a cracked window. Strangled. It was at once too brutal and too intimate. Death by illness or accident belonged to ordinary existence. Strangling belonged to rage. Fear, no secrecy. Miss Marple remained a little apart from the others, one gloved hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. Her eyes moved over the scene not with excitement, but with the same thoughtful attention she might have given to a difficult piece of knitting. There was the position of the body, slightly twisted, one hand near the collar of her dress, the other half curled. There was the small table by the wall, untouched. There was no sign of a struggle beyond the fatal mark itself. No broken vase, no overturned chair. curious. "If I may," said Miss Marple quietly, "was Mrs. Hawthorne expected to meet her nephew in here?" All eyes turned briefly toward her. Edwin, who looked both shaken and offended, answered at once. "Meet me? No, I sent no message." The maid Alice gave a start. "But, sir, I was told." "By whom?" "Doctor," Grant asked sharply. The girl blinked, frightened now by the weight of so many faces. "I was in the pantry when cook said Mr. Edwin wanted Mrs. Hawthorne in the house. So I went out to tell her." Edwin rounded on her. "I sent no such message." Alice looked on the verge of tears. "I only did as I was told, sir." Mr. Carver, finding perhaps that practical questions steadied the nerves, said, "Then we had better hear this plainly. Cook told Alice that Mr. Edwin wished to see his aunt. Alice carried the message into the garden. Mrs. Hawthorne came inside. But she never met her nephew." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "She met somebody else." Dr. Grant moved to the telephone stand in the morning room and rang for the police. His clipped explanation, stripped of all ornament, seemed to make the thing more dreadful. When he returned, so he found the others had drawn into uneasy groups, each apparently seeking protection in company, and yet each glancing at the others with the first faint stirrings of suspicion. Colonel Ashbury cleared his throat. "I think we should all say where we were. Best to have it out directly." "Quite right," said Mr. Carver, though in a tone suggesting that he wished the duty had fallen to someone else. Edwin gave a harsh laugh. "You talk as if one of us did it." No one answered. Perhaps that, more than anything, was the moment when the pleasant world of the afternoon finally collapsed. Margaret Linton spoke first. "I was by the tea table with Mrs. Dane and the rector's sister. I scarcely moved until the colonel went inside." Mrs. Dane, a plump woman with an eager face sharpened by habitual curiosity, nodded vigorously. "Yes, yes. Miss Linton was with me. We were speaking of the church roof fund." A slight expression passed over Miss Marple's face, for she knew well that if they had been speaking of the church roof fund, then Mrs. Dane had certainly been speaking of at least 3 people who had not contributed to it. Colonel Ashbury said, "I was circulating among the guests. Grant was near the far end of the lawn." Dr. Grant inclined his head. "I was, yes, with Carver." Mr. Carver confirmed it. "For most of the time?" "For most?" repeated Colonel Ashbury. Carver adjusted his cuffs. "Well, I went to fetch my hat from the hall chair perhaps 5 minutes before the alarm, but I saw nothing unusual." "Were you in this hall alone?" asked Miss Marple. "For half a minute only," he said. "Perhaps less. The front door was shut, so the place was empty." "Did you hear anything upstairs?" she asked. "No." "Or behind the house?" "No." Edwin, still staring at his aunt's body as if unable to accept the fact of it, said suddenly, "I was in the library. Ask anyone. I'd gone in there before the tea began." "Why?" asked Dr. Grant. Edwin flushed. "To write a letter." Miss Marple glanced toward him. "A letter requiring privacy?" His eyes moved to her, and for the first time he seemed to see not merely an elderly lady, but an intelligence that noticed tone as carefully as words. "Yes," he said shortly. From the rear corridor appeared cook herself, a stout and formidable woman named Mrs. Briggs, her face drained of color, but her spine as straight as ever. She seemed less overwhelmed than indignant, as though murder in Hawthorne House were a direct insult to the standards she had maintained for 20 years. "I never said Mr. Edwin wanted to see Mistress," she declared before anyone had questioned her. "I said there was a gentleman in the morning room asking for her." Every head turned. "A gentleman?" repeated Carver. "Yes. Alice was passing, and I said so. She must have misunderstood." "I did not misunderstand," Alice cried. "You said Mr. Edwin had sent word." "I said no such thing," Mrs. Briggs retorted, "though heaven knows there's enough confusion already without inventing more." Dr. Grant stepped between them. "That will do. Mrs. Briggs, what gentleman was it?" She looked blank for the first time. I didn't see him properly. I was in the kitchen passage and heard the front bell. When I came out, I caught sight of a man's back near the morning room door. Dark coat, tallish. I supposed Mistress was expected to receive him. You spoke to him? Asked Miss Marple. No. You saw his face? No, miss. Did he give a name? Mrs. Briggs frowned. Not to me. But you assumed he was waiting in the morning room, said Miss Marple. Yes. Dr. Grant looked toward the empty room. And when we found Mrs. Hawthorne, no gentleman was there. Which means, said Carver, with a dryness that failed to conceal his fear, that this mysterious visitor walked into the house, lured Eleanor Hawthorne inside, murdered her, and vanished from a hall full of guests. Unless, said Miss Marple gently, he was never a visitor at all. There was a pause. You mean someone already in the house, said Margaret in a low voice. Now Miss Marple gave a tiny nod, but did not elaborate. The grandfather clock ticked with exaggerated loudness. From upstairs came the faint, settling creak of old boards, the ordinary voice of an old house that now sounded sinister. Dr. Grant turned back to professional matters. No one is to go anywhere alone until the inspector arrives. We remain exactly where we are. Colonel Ashbury, perhaps seeking occupation, closed the front door firmly and drew the bolts. The heavy sound seemed final. Edwin ran a hand through his hair. This is madness. My aunt was alive not 15 minutes ago. There were 20 people on the lawn. 17, said Miss Marple. He stared at her. There were 17 on the lawn when Mrs. Hawthorne went in, she said. I counted because Mrs. Dane had just remarked upon the excellent turnout, as numbers have a way of fixing themselves in my mind. But only 16 remained by the time Colonel Ashbury went into the house. The hall went still again. Someone was missing, asked Dr. Grant. Yes. Miss Marple looked not at the body now, but toward the open doorway that led back to the garden where the teacups still sat abandoned under the late afternoon sun. Only for a few minutes, perhaps. But in village matters, and in murder, a few minutes are often quite enough. Before anyone could ask who, the distant sound of a motor car came up the drive. The police had arrived. The motor car's engine died outside the gravel drive, leaving a moment of unnatural stillness before footsteps approached the front door. Colonel Ashbury opened it, and a tall, non-deliberate-looking man entered with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being greeted by trouble. Inspector Wells removed his hat and surveyed the hall in a single, measured glance. His eyes paused briefly on the body of Mrs. Hawthorne, then moved calmly across the assembled faces. Inspector Wells, said Dr. Grant, thank heaven you came quickly. Village matters rarely wait for convenience, the inspector replied mildly. He stepped forward and knelt beside Mrs. Hawthorne, examining the bruise at her throat with professional care. The hall remained silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Strangulation, he said at last. Done with considerable force. No weapon required, of course. Hands would be sufficient. Edwin Hawthorne looked as though he might protest, but the inspector's quiet tone discouraged interruption. Wells stood and brushed his coat sleeve lightly. Now then, I should like everyone to remain calm. I understand there was a gathering in the garden. Yes, said Mr. Carver. 17 guests. 16, Miss Marple corrected gently. Inspector Wells turned toward her with polite curiosity. Indeed. She counted, said Colonel Ashbury. Miss Marple says one person was missing from the lawn for a few minutes. Inspector Wells regarded Miss Marple with interest. You noticed that, madam? Miss Marple smiled faintly. One tends to observe small irregularities in village life, Inspector. They often prove quite illuminating. Quite, he said thoughtfully. He took out a small notebook. Let us begin with the simplest facts. Mrs. Hawthorne entered the house alone. Alice, the maid, nodded nervously. Yes, sir. I asked her to come inside because cook said there was a gentleman waiting for her. Inspector Wells raised an eyebrow. A gentleman. Mrs. Briggs, standing stiffly near the back corridor, spoke firmly. I only said I thought there was a gentleman in the morning room. I saw the back of him after the front bell rang. You did not speak to him? No. You saw his face? No. Wells wrote something in his notebook. And when Mrs. Hawthorne entered the house, I stayed outside, sir, Alice said. I went back to the garden. And no one saw this gentleman leave? No one answered. The inspector looked around the hall, studying each face with patient care. That presents us with two possibilities, he said calmly. Either a stranger entered the house, committed the murder, and escaped unnoticed while a garden party was in progress, or the man seen by Mrs. Briggs was not a stranger at all. His gaze lingered on Edwin Hawthorne for a moment before continuing around the room. Miss Marple watched quietly, her expression thoughtful but mild. Inspector Wells closed his notebook. I should like each person to describe precisely where they were during the 15 minutes before the body was discovered. The questioning began slowly, moving from guest to guest. Mrs. Dane spoke first, her voice trembling but eager to be helpful. She repeated that she had remained near the tea table speaking with Miss Linton and the rector's sister. Margaret Linton confirmed it with quiet composure. Colonel Ashbury described circulating among the guests before eventually entering the house when Mrs. Hawthorne did not return. Dr. Grant and Mr. Carver both explained their conversation near the far end of the lawn, though Carver admitted he had briefly stepped inside to retrieve his hat. Inspector Wells paused at that. You entered the house alone? Yes. How long were you inside? Half a minute, perhaps. Did you see Mrs. Hawthorne? No. Did you see anyone else? No. Wells wrote again. Edwin Hawthorne was next. You say you were in the library, the inspector said. Yes. Writing a letter? Yes. Did anyone see you there? No, Edwin said sharply. But the door was open. Anyone could have. Inspector Wells made no comment. Did you hear your aunt enter the house? No. Did you hear any struggle? No. Did you leave the library before the colonel raised the alarm? No. The inspector studied him carefully before writing something else, as Miss Marple noticed the faint tightening around Edwin's eyes. At last, Wells turned to her. And you, Miss Marple. Miss Marple. Where were you seated? Near the foxgloves beside the pavilion. Did you remain there the entire time? Very nearly. Very nearly, he repeated. I did stand once to adjust my chair when the sun shifted, but I did not leave the lawn. The inspector nodded. And you counted 17 guests? Yes. Who was absent when the number became 16? Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. That is a little difficult to say with certainty. Inspector Wells smiled faintly. But you have an idea? Oh, yes, said Miss Marple gently. Every eye in the hall turned toward her. The old lady seemed perfectly untroubled by the attention. You see, she continued, village gatherings resemble embroidery patterns. One notices when a thread is missing, even if one cannot immediately say where it went. Inspector Wells waited patiently. Miss Marple glanced toward the open doorway leading to the garden. When Mrs. Hawthorne went into the house, Mr. Carver was standing near the tea table, she said quietly. But a few minutes later he had disappeared. Carver blinked. I told you I went inside for my hat. Yes, Miss Marple said kindly. And you returned shortly afterward. Inspector Wells nodded. That seems accounted for. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. She paused, her eyes drifting slowly across the faces gathered in the hall. But Mr. Carver was not the only one who left the lawn. The silence deepened. Miss Marple's gaze finally settled on someone standing near the staircase. Doctor, Grant also disappeared for several minutes. The doctor looked startled. That is absurd, he said quickly. I remained in the garden. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. You were there when Mrs. Hawthorne went into the house, she said, and again when Colonel Ashbury called for help. Inspector Wells's pencil stopped moving, but in between, Miss Marple said gently, I distinctly remember that you were not. A small ripple of tension moved through the hall. Dr. Grant stared at Miss Marple as though he had not quite heard her correctly. That is quite mistaken, he said sharply. I was on the lawn the entire time. Inspector Wells did not immediately speak. He merely watched the doctor with the calm patience of a man accustomed to allowing silence to do part of his work. Miss Marple did not appear offended. Oh, and I may well be mistaken, she said pleasantly. One's memory is such a curious thing. But I distinctly remember looking toward the far end of the lawn when Mrs. Dane was describing the unfortunate state of the church roof, and for a moment there seemed to be one less person near the rose arch. Mrs. Dane, who had been anxiously following the exchange, nodded eagerly. Yes, the rose arch. Dr. Grant had been standing there with Mr. Carver earlier. Carver adjusted his spectacles uneasily. Yes, we had been speaking there. Inspector Wells looked at Dr. Grant again. Perhaps you stepped away briefly, Doctor. Dr. Grant hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. I may have walked a little along the gravel path, he said, but I certainly did not enter the house. Miss Marple said nothing. The inspector closed his notebook for a moment and slipped it into his pocket. Well, he said quietly, that is a matter we shall return to shortly. He turned instead toward the staircase and studied the position of Mrs. Hawthorne's body once more. The mark on her throat was darkening now, a grim and unmistakable signature. Dr. Grant, he said, in your medical opinion, how quickly would death have occurred? The doctor seemed grateful for the return to professional ground. Very quickly, he said. Strangulation of that severity would likely cause unconsciousness within seconds. And death? A few minutes. Inspector Wells nodded slowly. Which means the attack must have occurred almost immediately after Mrs. Hawthorne entered the house. Yes. And with no sign of a struggle. Dr. Grant glanced down again. So no overturned furniture, no broken objects. It appears she was taken by surprise. Miss Marple's soft voice entered the silence. Or by someone she trusted. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Inspector Wells looked thoughtfully toward the front door. It was closed when the body was discovered? Yes, said Colonel Ashbury. Just as it is now. And no one saw anyone leave the house? No. Wells stepped to the door and examined the latch. It was an old brass fitting, well polished from years of use. A heavy door, he murmured. Mrs. Hawthorne always insisted on keeping it shut, said Edwin. She disliked draughts. Inspector Wells nodded and opened the door briefly, studying the gravel path outside before closing it again. Then he walked slowly across the hall to the small table near the wall where several calling cards lay beside a silver tray. Did anyone hear the front bell? He asked. Mrs. Briggs spoke at once. I did. That is why I came out of the kitchen passage. I saw a gentleman near the morning room door. Inspector Wells considered this. And you are certain he entered through the front door? That is where the bell is. Did anyone else hear the bell? He asked the room. There was a pause. Margaret Linton spoke hesitantly. I remember hearing something faint, but the music was playing at the time. The inspector nodded. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the silver tray. How curious, she murmured. Inspector Wells turned. Yes, Miss Marple. Well, you see most callers in a village house leave their card, she said. Particularly if they expect to be received by the lady of the house. Inspector Wells followed her gaze. The tray was empty. No card, he observed. Quite, said Miss Marple. Carver frowned. Perhaps the man had not yet placed it there. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. Inspector Wells studied the tray thoughtfully, then looked again at Mrs. Briggs. You saw the back of this gentleman only? Yes. Dark coat? Yes? Tall. Tallish. Inspector Wells glanced slowly around the hall. Nearly every man present wore a dark coat. Miss Marple watched the inspector with quiet approval. He was proceeding in exactly the right manner. Patiently, methodically, allowing the shape of the puzzle to reveal itself rather than forcing it too quickly. Inspector Wells returned his attention to the body. "Doctor," he said, "would Mrs. Hawthorne have resisted a stranger?" "Certainly," Dr. Grant replied. "Anyone would. But perhaps not someone familiar." Dr. Grant gave a reluctant nod. "Yes, that is possible." Miss Marple spoke again, almost to herself. "It is always remarkable how little noise people make when surprised." Inspector Wells looked up. "You have observed that before?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "Human beings behave very differently when they feel safe." The inspector considered her words for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Which suggests Mrs. Hawthorne opened the door willingly." Edwin shifted impatiently. "This is all very well, Inspector, but someone must have been here." "A stranger." "The maid was told a gentleman was waiting." "Yes," said Wells calmly, "and yet no one saw him leave." Silence returned. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly around the hall once more. At last it rested upon the staircase. Her eyes lingered there. Inspector Wells noticed. "You see something, Miss Marple?" She hesitated politely. "Well, it may be nothing. I should like to hear it." Miss Marple looked toward the second step of the staircase. "There is a very faint scuff mark on the wood," she said. Everyone turned. It was indeed there, a small streak across the polished surface, as though made by the sole of a shoe sliding suddenly. Inspector Wells crouched beside it. "Interesting," he murmured. Miss Marple folded her hands again. "You see," she said gently, "if Mrs. Hawthorne was attacked immediately after entering the hall, she must have taken at least one step forward." Inspector Wells nodded slowly. "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the closed door of the morning room. "And that means," she said quietly, "the person who killed her was not standing at the door at all." Inspector Wells remained crouched beside the faint scuff on the second stair for several moments, studying it with a thoughtful frown. The mark was small, almost nothing at all, something that might easily have been overlooked in the confusion of the discovery. Yet Miss Marple had seen it immediately, and that fact alone caused him to treat it with more interest than it might otherwise deserve. He rose slowly and glanced toward the staircase as though attempting to picture the exact sequence of events. "Mrs. Hawthorne enters the house," he said quietly. "She closes the door behind her. She steps forward, perhaps intending to go toward the morning room." "Doctor," McGrant nodded. "That would be logical if she believed someone was waiting there." Inspector Wells looked again at the scuff. "And then she is attacked." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "But not from the doorway," she said. "No," Wells agreed. "From somewhere else in the hall." Colonel Ashbury shifted uneasily. "You mean someone was already here?" "That seems increasingly likely," said the inspector. A murmur passed through the room. The implication hung in the air like a shadow. If the killer had already been inside the house, then the explanation of a mysterious visitor vanished completely. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the morning room door again. Inspector Wells followed her gaze. "You were thinking of that room earlier, Miss Marple." "Well, yes," she said gently. "If Mrs. Hawthorne believed someone was waiting there, she might naturally walk in that direction." Wells crossed the hall and opened the door to the morning room. The small room was neat and orderly, its windows looking out over the rose garden. 2 armchairs faced a small table where a vase of late summer flowers stood undisturbed. There was no sign that anyone had recently occupied the room. Inspector Wells stepped inside and looked around carefully. The carpet showed no marks. The chairs had not been moved. After a moment, he returned to the hall. "No one waited there," he said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. Edwin Hawthorne ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This is absurd. If no one was in the morning room and no stranger came to the door, then how did my aunt come inside at all? Because she was told someone wished to see her, said Carver. Yes, but who told her? Alice spoke timidly. I did, sir. Yes, said Wells. But who told you? Alice looked helplessly toward Mrs. Briggs. Cook crossed her arms firmly. I only said I thought I saw someone. I didn't send any message. Inspector Wells tapped his notebook thoughtfully against his palm. So the chain is this, he said. Mrs. Briggs believes she saw a gentleman near the morning room. Alice carries the message to Mrs. Hawthorne. Mrs. Hawthorne comes inside. And the murderer is waiting, Colonel Ashbury finished grimly. Miss Marple watched the exchange quietly. There was something about the way Mrs. Briggs had described the supposed visitor that lingered in her mind. The back of a man in a dark coat. Tallish, a glimpse only. It reminded her faintly of something she had once observed at a church fete many years before, when a certain gentleman had cleverly allowed several people to believe he had been present in 2 different places at once. Inspector Wells spoke again. Mrs. Briggs, when you saw this man's back, where exactly was he standing? In the hall passage, near the morning room door. Facing the door? Yes. And you were behind him? Yes. Did he move when you appeared? No, sir. I only saw him for a second before I turned back toward the kitchen. Miss Marple's eyes brightened very slightly. Inspector Wells looked toward the guests again. There is still the matter Miss Marple mentioned earlier, he said. During the crucial few minutes, 2 gentlemen left the lawn. Mr. Carver, who admits stepping into the house, and Dr. Grant, whose movements are less certain. Dr. Grant stiffened. Hush, I've already explained that. Yes, said Wells calmly, but explanations are not the same as facts. The doctor's expression darkened, though he said nothing. Miss Marple moved a little closer to the staircase. She studied the scuff mark again. Inspector, she said softly. Yes? I wonder if I might ask something rather simple. Of course. When Mrs. Briggs saw the gentleman in the hall, she only saw his back. That is correct. And she assumed he had entered through the front door. Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands. But that is only an assumption, you see. Inspector Wells looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Miss Marple glanced toward the staircase once more. Well, she said gently, if someone wished Mrs. Hawthorne to believe a visitor had arrived, it would be quite easy to arrange. The inspector's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Arrange how? Miss Marple smiled faintly. By standing where Mrs. Briggs would see only the back of a gentleman in a dark coat. The hall grew very still. And then, Miss Marple continued quietly, walking upstairs before Mrs. Hawthorne ever entered the house. Inspector Wells looked at Miss Marple for a long moment after she spoke. The silence in the hall seemed to deepen, as though every person present sensed that the quiet old lady had just moved the investigation onto a new and dangerous path. Upstairs, the inspector repeated slowly. Miss Marple nodded. You see, if the supposed visitor was never a visitor at all, but someone already belonging to the house or the party, and then the appearance of a stranger was merely a little performance. Mrs. Briggs glimpsed the back of a man in a dark coat and naturally assumed he had just arrived. Inspector Wells turned his eyes toward the staircase again. And then that man went upstairs before Mrs. Hawthorne came in. Precisely. Dr. Grant gave a short, impatient laugh. That theory is impossible. Why would anyone go upstairs if they intended to meet her in the hall? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. To wait until she stepped inside and turned her back. Inspector Wells said nothing, but he moved slowly toward the staircase. His shoes made soft sounds on the tiles as he reached the first step and examined the banister. There is dust here, he said quietly. Colonel Ashbury frowned. Dust? Yes, but a portion of the rail has been disturbed. He ran a finger across it and held it up. Quite recently. Miss Marple nodded slightly. One can lean over the banister from the first landing, she said, and see the front door very clearly. Inspector Wells ascended 2 steps and looked down toward the hall entrance. Yes, he said, you could see precisely when Mrs. Hawthorne entered. The assembled guests began to understand. The murderer had not waited in the hall or in the morning room. The murderer had waited above, watching. Miss Marple continued quietly. Mrs. Hawthorne comes in, closes the door, and takes a step forward. At that moment, the person upstairs descends quickly. She hears someone behind her and turns perhaps half around. That would explain the scuff mark on the stair where she tried to step backward. Inspector Wells nodded. And then the attack occurs. Dr. Grant looked troubled now. But even if that were true, the killer would still have to return to the garden afterward without being seen. Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look. Yes, she said, but only someone who belonged at the gathering could do that without raising alarm. The inspector descended the stairs again and faced the room. Then we must ask, he said quietly, who had the opportunity to go upstairs during those few minutes. All eyes turned again toward Dr. Grant and Mr. Carver. Carver swallowed. I told you I only stepped inside briefly. And I did not enter the house at all, Dr. Grant said firmly. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. But you did walk toward the house, she said. Dr. Grant's eyes flashed. I told you I walked along the gravel path. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Toward the house. Inspector Wells looked carefully at the doctor. Did you enter the house, Dr. Grant? No. Did you go upstairs? Certainly not. Miss Marple sighed softly, almost regretfully. It is always so disappointing when people insist upon denying things that are so plainly true. The doctor stared at her. What nonsense is this? Miss Marple turned to Inspector Wells. You see, Inspector, the whole plan depended on one small misunderstanding. Yes? Mrs. Briggs saw the back of a tall man in a dark coat and assumed he was a visitor, but several gentlemen here match that description. The important point is not the coat. It is the behavior. Inspector Wells waited, and Miss Marple continued. Dr. Grant knew Mrs. Hawthorne would come inside if she believed a caller was waiting. He allowed Mrs. Briggs to glimpse him in the hall and then went upstairs to wait. The doctor's face had grown pale. That is absurd. Is it? Miss Marple said gently. You see, Dr. Grant had a very strong reason to speak privately with Mrs. Hawthorne. Something rather delicate concerning a certain investment scheme she had recently discovered. A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Edwin looked up sharply. Investment scheme? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Dr. Grant had persuaded several villagers to place money in what he described as a medical development fund. Mrs. Hawthorne discovered only yesterday that the company in question did not exist. Inspector Wells's eyes sharpened. Is that true, Doctor? Doctor. Grant said nothing. Miss Marple continued. She told Mrs. Dane this morning that she intended to confront the matter during the party. That would have ruined Dr. Grant completely. Inspector Wells stepped closer to the doctor. So you arranged a meeting in the house before she could expose you. Dr. Grant's composure finally cracked. You have no proof of any of this. Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic smile. Oh, I believe we do. When you descended the stairs after the murder, you brushed the banister. That disturbed the dust Inspector Wells noticed. You then returned quietly through the side passage to the garden. The inspector nodded slowly. And you were the one person who could immediately confirm Mrs. Hawthorne was dead. Dr. Grant's shoulders sagged. For a moment no one spoke. At last he said bitterly, She was going to destroy everything. Inspector Wells placed a hand on his arm. I'm afraid you have done that yourself. 2 constables who had arrived quietly behind the inspector stepped forward. Dr. Grant did not resist as they led him toward the door. The late afternoon sunlight lay warm and peaceful over the garden, as though the world outside Hawthorne House remained perfectly ordinary. Inside the hall, the tension slowly began to dissolve. Colonel Ashbury shook his head. "Extraordinary," he muttered. Mr. Carver adjusted his spectacles. "To think it happened right above our heads." Inspector Wells turned to Miss Marple. "My thanks, Miss Marple. You noticed the one thing that mattered." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "It was really quite simple." "How so?" She glanced once more at the staircase. "In villages," she said gently, "people are always watching one another, but they forget that someone might be watching them from above." Outside, the quartet slowly resumed their interrupted music. And in the quiet village of Brambleford, life began once more to return to its peaceful appearance, though those who had stood in Hawthorne House that afternoon would forever remember the door that had closed and the danger that had waited unseen just beyond it.